I've always been enamored with Ntozake Shange's poetic and rhythmic play called For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. It's a long title, but prophetic, drawing paradoxes, questions, and answers all in one tiny sentence. For me, For Colored Girls is like the OG Solange, the OG It Girl, the OG Erykah Badu. It's a show that is vulnerable and unrelentless love letter to Black and brown women everywhere. And I think it is still somehow underrated. I don't think that we talk enough about this masterpiece, and that's why I wanted to do that. I also want to say, if you catch me looking down, it's because I'm looking at my laptop, which is right here. These videos take a lot of work, a lot of scripting, a lot of researching to make. They're incredibly hard, and I think that's also why it takes me so long to put up a video. And so I want to give myself some slack with that by having my laptop here, because it is very hard to memorize a whole script and do that by myself. Thanks. Okay, let me back up for a second. What is For Colored Girls? So this play is a 1976 work by Ntozake Shange. It consists of a series of poetic monologues to be accompanied by dance movements, music, and a form which Shange coined the word called choreo-poem to describe the show's rhythm and her writing style. I'll get more into that later. Shange says, quote, "The poems the characters speak are the play's first hint of the global misogyny that we women face." For Colored Girls has been performed off-Broadway as well as on Broadway, and was adapted into a 1982 television film and a 2010 theatrical film, which the 2010 film is arguably the worst adaptation, thanks Tyler Perry. I'm not gonna get really into that too much in this video, but just know that it is the least poetic and the least interesting in all of these iterations. The production was first performed by Shange along with 4 other artists at the Bacchanal, which was a women's bar outside of Berkeley, California. Then at the age of 27, Shange moved to New York, where in July 1975, the reworked For Colored Girls was professionally produced in New York City at Studio Rivera. The show grew increasingly popular, specifically with Black and Latinx artists and audiences, and as a result, For Colored Girls Who Have Considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough opened at the Public Theater in June of 1976. 3 months later, in September, the show was performed at the Booth Theater on Broadway, where it was continued until July 1978, and it ran for 742 shows. Shange even performed at the time as Lady in Orange at the Broadway opening, and I'll get more into her as well. There are 7 characters, and they're kind of titled as a color. So for instance, there's Lady in Orange, Lady in Yellow, Lady in Green, Lady in Blue, Lady in Brown, Lady in Red, and Lady in Purple. Each character gets their own moment to speak in a choreo poem about their lives and the struggles they face directly to the audience.
Without any assistance or guidance from you, I have loved you assiduously for 8 months, 2 weeks, and a day. I've been stood up 4 times. I've left 7 packages on your doorstep, 40 poems, 2 plants, and 3 handmade note cards.
So the show itself kind of removes that wall that usually is put in shows where it's like nobody's acknowledging that there's like an audience there. This actually does the opposite. And again, remember, at the time, that's pretty new and revolutionary. Now we see a lot of shows that do that, you know, they kind of interact with the audience, but in the 70s, it was a little different. Not to say that they didn't have that, but it was just something that wasn't that popular then. The premiere performance of For Colored Girls starred Beverly as Lady in Red, Lori Carlos as Lady in Blue, Rizé Collins as Lady in Purple, Aku Kododo as Lady in Yellow, Janet Leigh as Lady in Brown, Paula Moss as Lady in Green, and of course, Ntozake Shange as Lady in Orange. The production also featured original music. One such title was I Found God in Myself, which was by Diana Wharton.
I was missing something.
Something so important.
Something promised.
A laying on of hands.
Fingers near my forehead.
When I found God in myself.
scenic designer was Ming Cho Lee, who I believe we've talked about on this channel before. The costume design was done by Judy Deering, and lighting design was by Jennifer Tipton. In terms of scenic design, things are very sparse and minimal. It seems like there's just like a dance floor that might be black. It's hard to tell because the picture is in black and white. And then behind them, it looks like there's just a curtain that's probably black. There also seems to be this kind of floral arrangement in the back, but I can't exactly identify what that is. And that's it for scenic. I want to also say that it should be noted that the show uses exclusively Black dialect. There are many different types of Black dialect in the US, or we also call it AAVE. AAVE has very specific rules despite what some might say. For instance, it uses double negative, it has an omitted B, it has a habitual B, and then there's also a lot of present and perfect stress tenses, which you can look up what all of these mean. There's a lot of different websites and sources about AAVE, so that is important. But I just want to make it clear that there are many different types of ways to speak in a Black dialect. And again, this is very important in Shange's work. Shange states, quote, "Yes, they were written in the language of the people, so that there was a specific voice, a specific accent, a specific dialect for every person in every area. I knew that. I grew up around that," end quote. However, AAVE sounds a little different to the untrained ear, and you really kind of have to be steeped in Black culture to understand it. Many years, AAVE has been at the helm of many microaggressions, but it is in fact its own language. This also means, which something that Shange said, is the way that Black vernacular English is written looks different as well. For instance, some words can be pushed together, I is not capitalized, and words can be shortened or letters have something added to them. For instance, like was, W-A-S, is actually was, W-A-Z. Shange writing in a very specific way is revolutionary. I think that she's really pushing against white supremacy actively by reclaiming English and just taking it as her own and as her culture's own. Let's talk a little bit about the creation of this play and how it integrates dialect, music, and rhythmic dancing. Going back to the topic of choreo poems, which is very important because it's a big part of who Shange is and it's a big part of her work. So much of this play revolves around music connected to Black and Brown communities and also an intention to rhythm. Shange really believes in poems, and you can see this play out in all of her work, especially this one. And she also really believes that poems should be spoken rather than just read. She really believes in poetry having its own community of audience, and that's how it's brought to life, instead of just being in a book.
I think we should examine serial monogamy. Is it one at a time or one for a long time?
The definition of a choreo poem is a form of dramatic expression that combines poetry, dance, music, and song. The term was coined in 1975 by Shange and the choreographer Paula Moss, who was also in the show. And it was derived as Shange's kind of attempt to depart from traditional Western poetry and storytelling, and it resulted in this new art form that doesn't really contain specific plot elements or characters, but instead focuses on creating an emotional response from the audience. I want to also emphasize the importance of music in Shange's work. Music such as like Dancing in the Street, merengue, cha-cha, cole are all mentioned in the show's direct text. Now, that doesn't mean that theaters who decide to do the show have to do the same exact thing, but I think they do need to understand the music's importance. Shange directly used music that inspired her and then inspired the women who were in the ensemble as she wrote and while they were workshopping and creating it. So therefore, when other people put on this play, they should be using music that inspires them in that way. Also, rhythm in correlation to the music and choreo poems is also an important factor to kind of get the poetic nature of the show correct. Shange really uses all aspects of play, call and response, and dancing in community, which are very, very tied to Black and brown communities specifically. Quote, "Through improvisation, we discovered and enhanced the beginning of drama. We encouraged the children games of Miss Mary Mack, hopscotch, ring dance, common games which drew most girls of color into a public arena, exhibiting coordination, verbal pyrotechnics, and early sexuality," end quote. Lastly, something that also makes this show so striking is its use of dance. And it's highlighted in what kind of choreo poem is, as we've talked about. But I also just want to state this because it's also highlighted in who Shange is. And it makes sense that this was incorporated since Shange herself was a skilled trained dancer. She states, quote, "Yes, I was involved in dance seriously for about 10 or 15 years. I stayed in New York and San Francisco. I had excellent teachers and a cadre of dancers who were my friends and colleagues for years and who still are," end quote. And it's funny, even when you're reading it, it doesn't really have direct context that maybe they're dancing, but just the way that the play flows off the tongue, it just feels so dance heavy. Also, quote, "We dance to keep from crying. We gotta dance to keep from dying," which is on page 29 of this play. Speaking of the tie between dance and this show, this is also why the costumes for colored girls are simple yet iconic. They're very kind of naturalistic in a sense. The costume designer Judy Deering chose mid-length ballet-style dresses in the various colors of each character. They flow off the ensemble's bodies easily and are able to create rhythmic movements as they dance. The costumes actually are so iconic that they're currently displayed at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. You can go there in person and view them, but they also have an online database where you can see. The body, as mentioned, is essential in all of Shange's work, with her influences as a dancer, but also because as an artist, she's always been interested in form and healing. In many of the moments when music and dance are incorporated in the show, it just kind of feels like a release for its audience and ensemble. In some ways, the movement and dance can even feel joyful in contrast to the words that these women speak of violence and misogyny in their monologues. I think the dancing is kind of integral to keeping the show very light and prophetic, and in a lot of ways I can't help but think that sometimes Solange is very much tied or inspired by this show, just because the way in which her dancing is kind of very similar to Colored Girls. It feels like too much of a coincidence. Some people do criticize this show, saying it doesn't really have a plot or a point, and that it doesn't sell well because it needs to have a reason to sell. But this is ironic for a very specific reason. Shange states, quote, "The commercial people tell me that one of the reasons the rest of my work hasn't been commercially successful as for Colored Girls is that it has no point that they could sell. That's because there's going to be no point. I'm not writing about a point. For Colored Girls doesn't have a point either, but they made a point out of it. Those girls were people whom I cared about, people whom I offered to you, for you to see and to know. Black and Latin writers have to start demanding the fact that we're alive, and that is a point enough." I think that's really true and telling. Black and brown people do not need to sell themselves. They don't need a point. Surviving and being able to live is enough, period. And that is art on its own, no matter what capitalism might tell you, or how productive you need to be, or how much value your work has to have. Like, there's no value on it. I also want to take a step back to discuss who Ntozake Shange is, because I think it's really important to talk about the people who create art that we like. So, who is Ntozake Shange? Well, she was born October 18th, 1948, so she is indeed a Libra. And she was born with the name Paulette Linda Williams to an upper-class family in Trenton, New Jersey. But later, she did change her name in 1970. And this would be kind of a popular move amongst many Black American artists to change their name. So that's not anything really new. You'll start to notice as you kind of do more research on artists of that time, they do change their names for various reasons. She also had two sisters, Bisa Williams and Ife Beiza. They are both equally amazing and they deserve their own videos, which is saying something. I always love a sibling duo. She really seems to have been inspired by her sisters, and they contributed to a lot of her thoughts and her thinking as she was growing up. I want to go back to her childhood a little bit, but at 8 years old, her family moved from New Jersey to St. Louis, where Shange went to an integrated school. However, this is kind of where she endured a lot of racist attacks, and she had really bad experiences. She would eventually return back to New Jersey at 13 years old and then stay there. Her family growing up had a strong interest in the arts, and honestly, I think this is a big part of her personality and her writing. Their family would host artists such as Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Chuck Berry, Paul Robeson, and even W.E.B. Du Bois, which I think they all deeply affected her poetry. And because of this, she stated, quote, "Politics were integral to my existence and to my sisters." Then later on in college, she even hung out with, quote, the Young Lords, who were a largely Hispanic group that encouraged and supported a more feminist view. It's really interesting to note that the Black Panthers did not have that same feminist guideline that the Young Lords did. Again, that's like a different video for another day, but I think Shange was really interested in joining a political party and a political group that cared about equal rights for all. And not to say that the Black Panthers didn't do that, but in some ways they were a little misogynist, and I think she was really trying to fight against that. However, it wasn't all easy for Shange. She felt really disconnected and split from many of her Black peers. Quote, "As it was for many women raised in conventional families, getting married was supposed to be the thing, right? So there was an early union that ended relatively quickly. But what to do as a colored girl who didn't want any of that? Shange tried to commit suicide a number of times, and she was defensive, vulnerable, and bitter. It would be years before that she was diagnosed with having a bipolar disorder, which also really affected her. Even though she had those downfalls, Shange eventually graduated cum laude in American Studies, woot woot, at Barnard College, and then she earned a master's degree in the same field from the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. I don't want to say too much, but I'm gonna just put it on the table that we're both Libras and we both have degrees in American Studies, and I feel like that's 2 for 2. We're going 2 for 2. Also, while being in the Bay Area is when she got to join in a community with women like herself. They kind of inspired and taught her a lot about being a womanist and liberation and poetry, which she really took a hold on. Somewhat during that time, she is also acknowledged as having been the founding poet of the Norican Poets Cafe. This was really essential and influential in poetry, just in general. I would love to get into this topic, but again, that's another video for another day because they deserve their own video. So just kind of flag that in the back of your mind that Shange was a part of this group. A lot of people mistake her for being part of the Black arts movement, and while many of her works and her peers kind of had to do with that movement, Shange's work was unabashedly feminist, which is kind of in its own lane. The Black arts movement did produce some amazing work, but it has been criticized for being kind of misogynist. There's a famous playwright named Amare Bakarai, who's a really talented playwright and writer, but I do agree that he is absolutely violent in how he depicts women in his plays, if there are even women. And he was kind of a big leader among the Black arts movement. He stated, quote, that several women writers, among them being Ntozake Shange, had their own Hollywood aesthetic of capitulation and garbage, end quote. Now, saying something is garbage is kind of, that's wild. But you know, despite the criticism, Shange resisted and continued to make art. Within that same time, she would star and write in For Colored Girls, which would be a major success, winning an Obie, and most importantly, it just connected with Black and brown women from all over the country. Shange also wrote other successful plays, including Spell Number 7, a 1979 choreo poem that explores the Black experience, and an adaptation of Brecht's Mother, Courage and Her Children, which also won an Obie Award. I have not read either of these, but I'm really interested and curious. I'm gonna have to try to get these so I can read them, because I feel like they're not really talked about. Shange would also begin to teach at major universities like University of Houston. She would edit major publications, and she would still submit her poetry, short stories, and plays for publication. Later on in life, unfortunately, Shange did suffer from a series of strokes, which would kind of leave her never the same. And then on October 27th, 2018, she would pass away in her sleep. Despite those series of strokes never kind of leaving her the same and rendering some of her face and her body paralyzed, she still was very persistent in doing work and reading poetry and even doing some interviews. In addition to the original premiere of For Colored Girls, there's also recently been a revival, and I want to talk a little bit about that. The revival of the show started at the Public Theater in New York 2019. It was met with a lot of success and the tickets sold out pretty quickly. The version of For Colored Girls that I have is the Public Theater version, but I mean, it's still the same. I don't think they added or changed anything. The only difference is that it's got a couple different like intros, like there's an intro from Camille Brown, things like that, which we'll talk about a little bit. This revival at the Public Theater was directed by Leah C. Gardner, and the choreography was by Camille A. Brown. Leah C. Gardner is an Obie winning director. She's also a writer for television. And looking through her work, she's done some pretty interesting plays that focus specifically on Black women. She stated about her revival at the Public, quote, "Inja Jacque and her work have influenced my poetic and theatrical career for over 20 years. As a young woman graduating from the University of Pennsylvania, I was lucky enough to work with Inja Jacque as her personal assistant for 6 months. I remember eagerly soaking up her creative energy and wishing it would never end. I went off to live and work in England and came home to study directing at the Yale School of Drama. For my time away from the States, her essence, her power, and her words never left me." Right after the Public run, it transferred to Broadway. However, something did happen in between the end of 2019, or I guess it's the beginning of 2020 and 2022. And so it took some time actually to get to Broadway, or to get its opening. The revival opened in April 20th of 2022 and then closed in June 5th of 2022. I personally believe that it would have had more performances. It just had really bad timing. Right after the pandemic was probably not the time to do it. And people were still just kind of like iffy about going into, you know, large spaces, and it was very hard to see shows then. The cast for the Public Theater rendition consisted of Sasha Allen, Celia Chevalier, Renata Eastlick, Danae Esperanza, Jubal Khan, L'Oreal Lampley, Jamie Lawson, Adrian Seymour, Okwe Opakwasili, Alexandria Wallace, and Dee Woods. Now, once it transferred to Broadway, the cast, the director, and the costumes changed slightly. So for the Broadway run, Camille A. Brown took on the role of both director and choreographer. The cast, like I said, did change slightly. So a couple people from the Public Theater didn't make it to the Broadway version, and I think that had to do with like scheduling and conflicts, things like that. And I'll get a little bit more into the costumes later.
Little baby like shortening, mama's little baby like shortening bread.
But I do want to talk about Camille A. Brown, who took on the role of both director and choreographer for this rendition. And it's funny because, quote, "More than 3 decades after its 1976 Broadway run, the first Broadway revival of For Colored Girls has launched, directed and choreographed by Camille A. Brown, the first Black woman to direct and choreograph a Broadway show in 65 years. The most recent run has garnered 7 Tony Award nominations, including Best Revival of a Play and Best Direction of a Play for Camille Brown." That is crazy. 65 years? I think Camille A. Brown is pretty significant, and I've talked about her on the channel before. She's done her own kind of choreographed pieces and choreo for things like Jesus Christ Superstar Live, Once on This Island, and even Hell's Kitchen. Her choreography is very specific because it requires a lot of historical context. What I mean by that is that her work is based on social dance, activism, and storytelling. Her work is very community-based and it's very interactive. Individuals coming together and creating community is what she's all about. And she's very visual in her dance. I think it's super expressive without words, and it's pretty collaborative. She's really devoted to the Black community, and so a lot of her work is that. I'm a really big fan of her work. Like, I've been a big fan for many years, and it's just like very exciting to see the work that she's doing in real time. And I could say more, but I don't want to fangirl, so I won't. I think this is a really great tie-in to kind of connecting the original play with a revival. Like, Camille A. Brown is such a perfect person to bring it in because she invites collaboration, she invites play, she invites improvisation, she invites dance. It's like a perfect melding. I can't think of anybody better to choreograph and direct, to be honest. In its revival, costumes would also play a big role. This time, Toni Leslie James, for the public version, took on the role as costume designer. The clothing this time would still be flowy, but it would put more of an emphasis on each woman's unique body shape and size by adding more shape to each dress or set. And what's cool is not every character would have a dress or a skirt. The costumes would also become more unique and a little less collective based while still maintaining an ensemble kind of choreographed look. She stated in an interview at the public, quote, "In designing for Colored Girls, the director's mandate was to create clothing that paid homage to the past while creating clothing that was contemporary, yet personal to the actor. I found a design line that had printed photographs in the fabric prints, along with a story in the New York Times where the upholstery fabric also featured photographs of people of color in the print. This inspired me regarding making the costumes personal to the actor and bringing the past into the present. We ended up asking each actors to send in photographs of their most beloved female relative, and we used those photographs to create prints of their clothing." I really loved this idea of adding like photos to a print. Like, I'd never really seen anything like that, and it was just so beautiful seeing pictures of it. But unfortunately, the Broadway run would kind of change the costumes completely, making them less flowy, more silhouetted, and more modern. Actually, they would become very modern. I also want to say, yes, there have been revivals, and that's great, but it's also an understatement to say that many colleges all over the country have and will perform this show, and many Black women perform monologues from Shange's work all the time. So why is it a masterpiece? This is one of the few shows that allows Black women to be angry, and I mean angry, to be really rageful unapologetically, to show joy, youth, anger, empathy, and vulnerability without guilt. And I think that is so beautiful and so telling. From a video titled "Her Pen is Her Machete," quote, "She's able to take topics that are very painful, like incest and violence, while at the same time giving us possibilities for moving past and through them," end quote. I think in that she really showcases all that Black